Welcome to Books on Faith and Meaning. My name is Matt Croasmun. I'm the Faith Initiative Director at the Grace Farms Foundation. Each month we take up a new book to help us ask the question of what is the shape of flourishing life? What would it mean to live lives worthy of our shared humanity? And, that can seem like a really lofty goal, especially given the fact that our lives seem to be sort of dominated often by anxiety. The news fills our minds with causes for anxiety, war, climate disaster, political upheaval. Our private lives are full of similar causes or their own sorts of causes for anxiety. Work, family, friendships, even the things that we love most, perhaps particularly because we care for them, we worry. They feel tenuous, and so they become causes for anxiety for us. We are, as often turns out to be the case, we are not the first generation to experience life this way, not the first to sort of wonder about anxiety and its role. Many of the ancients noted this as a feature of human life. And our book for today, Living for Pleasure, an Epicurean Guide to Life, offers Epicurus's particular diagnosis and prescription for us to live lives free from anxiety. And we are so fortunate to have with us today the book's author, Emily A. Austin. She is professor of philosophy at Wake Forest University. She specializes in ancient Greek philosophy, particularly in ancient approaches to the fear of death. Emily, if I may,
yes,
welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, as I hope I got, first of all, I really enjoyed this book. It's written so conversationally, so winsomely. Is that like too old of a word to use?
It's great.
It's a
it's
joy.
A great word. It's a good SAT word.
There you go. It's a joy to read and just to think together with Epicurus and with you on what are both sort of ancient and, you make a point to show, also very, very modern concerns. A lot of people know Epicurus. If they know Epicurus at all, they would think Epicurus, that's the guy. Was he a famous chef or like a famous cook, or was he like a wine connoisseur? Or maybe if you know a little bit more, you think like, oh, he was that like hedonist, right? Like eat, drink, marry, be merry. Tomorrow we shall die. But you say actually the best way, yeah, pleasure is part of it, but the best way to think about it is as a pursuit of tranquility or as freedom from anxiety. Can you help us sort of make some sense of how those two things go together for him, pleasure and this freedom from anxiety?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that is really fascinating about Epicurus that distinguishes him from a lot of his philosophical competitors at the time, like the Stoics, is that he really focused a lot on the fact that we're animals. So he had a proto-evolutionary account of the origins of human society and of sort of according to which the animals that surround us right now are the animals that have proved fittest for survival. And so he really did want to focus on the fact that humans are animals. And so that means we come at the world with our senses, our five senses, but also we process the world and make sense of it through pleasure and pain. And so just like other animals, we have a lot of anxiety. Just like other animals, we enjoy pleasure. And that's how we explore the world. But we also have very souped up brains. So we're creatures in time. So we have a sense of ourselves in the present and the past and the future. And so we can learn from the past, reflect on our current existence, and predict things about the future based on what we've learned. And so in some sense, what he has is a kind of scientifically refined hedonism. And so he has just this account that, what we're doing is using these powers to live a pleasant life. And so some people have thought, oh, well, he was the ancient hedonist, like you're saying, right? So there's Epicurus, the recipe repository on the internet. And I remember, I don't really know French, but I took my mother to Paris because she'd never been. And I remember thinking, wow, his name is on every fancy grocery store. And so there is this sense in which, Epicurus has been associated with culinary things and hedonism. And one of the unfortunate things, I think, is that people who are charitable towards him and want to defend him, they overcorrect. So they say, oh no, he doesn't care about any of those things. He's just trying to get rid of anxiety. And the only pleasure he cares about is the relief of pain. As though, like Epicurus is like, make your shoes hurt really bad and then take them off. And then that's what pleasure is. And so really what he's thinking about is more just this idea that we have this background anxiety that comes from, being the sort of animals we are, vulnerable, not self-sufficient. And one of the key things we have to do is manage that anxiety. And so that is a huge part of it, because that's what keeps us from experiencing all these really distinctive human joys, like communion with others and, nice meals where you have fun and conversation. And the nice meal could be essentially sort of, like takeout from wherever, but you're enjoying it with friends. And so he is a hedonist. He's not a sex, drugs, and rock and roll hedonist. Okay. But he's also, not someone who thinks like, oh, you should never listen to rock and roll. Or and so I thought recently about this, that, when I was a kid, the Cookie Monster shoved cookies in his mouth like they were going out of style. And then much later, long after I had given up Sesame Street, obviously, there was an episode where Cookie Monster learned that cookies are a sometimes food. And this was a really transformative moment in the hedonism of Cookie Monster. And so I think that's kind of a little bit where Epicurus is.
Yeah.
These things are sometimes foods.
Yeah, Cookie Monster, when Cookie Monster learns that cookies are a sometimes food, he is growing in hedonistic prudence. Is that the philosophical term?
Yeah, and basically I think the thing goes something like, these other foods are every time foods or all time foods or something, which is always foods. and so I don't think Epicurus is ever going to say something is always, but he would say almost always. Like fruit is almost always good.
Yeah, well, you talk about you say that one of the key things that Epicurus wants to help us do is sort of sort through our desires. So if we're animals, we're desirous. We desire various things. And actually, this is a question we often come back to in the Faith Initiative at Grace Farms. We're thinking about this question, like, what's really worth wanting, right? Like, to sort of, and you talk a little about this in the book, we can sometimes have the sense that our desires are sort of like, I don't know, like self-authorizing or something like that. Like it's, anyway, it depends, which side you're coming from, right? If we were like channeling our inner Stoic, then we're suspicious of all of our desires. But in another sense, like some of us in modern context, yeah, we sort of think our desires are, or certainly somebody else's desires, are sort of self-authorizing. But Epicurus actually wants us to like sort through our desires a bit. And it seems like actually that's sort of like, yeah, like you said, not quite always, but then there's some sometimes, and then some nevers, maybe? Is that nevers. Like something like his three categories of desires? Can you tell us about those?
Well, there might not be any nevers, but there are some that are like only in cases where you need to break glass. I mean, just so rare that they might as well be. So he thinks that there's a lot to be gained by thinking about our desires, right? So even just like, our way of approaching pleasure is to desire it, right? So when we think about what we desire, we're thinking about what will give us pleasure. And so as a hedonist, he's like, oh, well, let's start with desire, because that's how we figure out, what we think will give us pleasure. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, will it, right? Or, and then when we get that pleasure, is it better than whatever pain comes along with it? Or is it better than a competing pleasure that if we had pursued it would give us greater satisfaction? And so there's this kind of calculus, and he thinks that one really good way to approach the calculus, especially from a psychological perspective, is to think, okay, let's categorize desires. And he has this threefold taxonomy, and he uses, unfortunately, super cumbersome words for it that I couldn't write or say over and over again, but he distinguishes between natural and necessary, natural and unnecessary, and unnatural and unnecessary desires. And so I call them in the book necessary desires, extravagant desires, and corrosive desires. So necessary desires, in the way that we've been talking about them so far, are always desires. Like they just come almost as a package of us being animals or the animals we are. So necessary desires for Epicurus are going to include things like food and water, because if we don't have them, it hurts. and left without them long enough we die. But also the things that creatures like us need in order to feel secure or have confidence about our security. And he thinks that includes things like an understanding of the natural world that will free us of superstition so that we can explain our surroundings and navigate them effectively, but also friends. So these would be friends who just make us feel both physically secure, but also help us on a path towards tranquility or towards understanding science. And so there are relationships and knowledge built into the necessary stuff because, again, we have these souped up brains. And that, he thinks, if you've got those things, which is a pretty rich collection of things when you think about it, he thinks that you have what you need to be satisfied. And to feel that you are secure in the world. And then that allows you to sort of pursue and select and enjoy kind of extravagant joys. Now, so for extravagances, what Epicurus has in mind are usually just kind of fancier versions of necessary things, right? So instead of water, it would be, if you were a beer drinker, a good IPA or something. If you were a kind of foodie, you might want a certain kind of sandwich or something rather than just food. And he thinks those are great as long as those desires don't cause you anxiety, like you really need them, or you think that they're necessary for satisfaction. Mm-hmm. Instead, they just kind of deepen your satisfaction or sort of add variety and joy to life. And then the other mistake that you might make, apart from thinking they're necessary, is you might care about them so much that they lead you to not satisfy the necessary ones. So if you, for instance, you thought something like, well, look, I can only eat a 5-course meal at a very fancy restaurant, right? But your good friend can't afford that, right? So you've just sort of alienated your friend by pursuing an extravagance. Then he would think that would be a problem. Or, you wanted to go to France, but your mother was really sick, right? So if you chose to go to France, then that would be sometime when you were neglecting something necessary or the maintenance of something necessary for something extravagant. But there are lots of times when it's totally okay to pursue extravagances. And most of the time, these are just really daily joys, like a conversation with friends or sort of the things that are memorable in your life. So, you don't really think, oh, I ate bread yesterday, but you do think, I had a great conversation with a friend yesterday. And then there are this last class of desires, which are pretty much the never desires. And these are desires that I call corrosive. He calls them unnatural and unnecessary. And what makes them unnatural is that they work against our tranquility, right? So they're not unnatural in the way that they're artificial. They're unnatural in the sense that they undermine our tranquility. And there are a couple of ways to think about these. One way to think about them is just sort of they complete the sentence, you can never have too much. Right? So you can never have too much money, you can never have too much power, you can never have too many clicks or too many likes, right? And so he calls those unlimited desires because there's always more. And the problem with an unlimited desire, among other things, is that it can never be satisfied, right? Because there's always more to have. And so you'll always want more, and so you can never be satisfied with what you have. And then because they come in comparative degrees, you can envy people who have more, or resent people who have more, or you can feel superior to people who have less. And so he thinks that these desires, apart from just being unsatisfiable, also usher in all these negative emotions. And so he thinks, well, when you approach the world, ask yourself, have I put limits on my desires so that they're satisfiable? And have I met these necessary desires so that I can more fully enjoy the extravagant desires and select them when they don't cause harm and they create these memories, but not when they distract me from what matters or I convince myself I need them.
So are the corrosive desires desires for a particular set of objects, or is it a particular kind of desire? Like, could I desire like a good thing in the wrong sort of way and have it become a sort of corrosive desire?
Yeah. So in fact, I think often that's more characteristic of corrosive desires than otherwise, right? So Epicurus thinks he has good reason to convince people that they should not be afraid of death, right? But he doesn't think that, he thinks, well, life is still really good, right? It's not like you're like, oh, death isn't bad, so I'm going to rush headlong into it. He thinks, no, life is really, really good. And so you should savor life, right? And life is worth desiring. but you shouldn't desire it in an unlimited way, right? So that you need more of it. And so you could say, I really enjoy life, but I don't need unlimited life. Or I need money to meet my necessities, and having some money to satisfy extravagances is good. But if I make my desire for wealth unlimited, then that's bad, right? So he'll even talk about like natural wealth versus like unnatural wealth. And so a lot of times I think it is this idea that nothing of this is ever enough, or more is always better. But if you had a limit for it, right, where you didn't need more, that would be fine. There are some things that are probably just intrinsically corrosive, right? So like if you had a desire to abuse people, for instance, or something like that. But when it's for objects like that we normally think of as things we want to pursue, he thinks it's more that we think of them in the wrong way, or make them competitive, or waste our time on them and distract ourselves from necessary things.
Yeah. That limit, I mean, I can begin to see then the ways that his thoughts on death are actually pretty central to his thinking then, because death becomes this sort of boundary on every good thing. And to want even, I mean, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems, especially on your account, that for Epicurus, relationships, friendships, community, these are some of the most, the sort of highest goods. Like on the best sort of the desire for those things are really, really good. And we might then be inclined to think, something like, I don't know, all joy like desires eternity, right? You have this sort of like, but it seems like for Epicurus that'd be a corruption of the desire, and in a certain way it gives him the ability to recognize some of the sort of insights that like the Stoics have, right? That like if you like hope for certain sorts of things, fears come along. And it seems like Epicurus, if I'm following you right, his answer would be, well, no, you can hope for good things. You should hope for good things, but you shouldn't hope for. But once you hope for them in eternity, right, or in without measure, then you're right. You will always have cause for fear. Is that right? And then would he say then that some of that? Sorry, I have a couple of things in the background of this question. Like one is sort of thinking about comparison with the Stoics, which you bring up. It seems like sort of necessary, like always in discussion of Epicureanism. The Stoics are sort of lurking behind, ready to score their points. Or as you more generously suggest, help Epicurus himself sharpen his position, help us understand and sharpen Epicurus' position. I'm also thinking about one of my Yale colleagues' books, Martin Hagelin's book, This Life.
Yeah, I actually listened to your interview with him earlier today, just to kind of get a sense.
Okay, yeah. So I'm thinking a bit about, right, so where he would sort of say, well, in a certain sense, the sort of fear of that vulnerability to loss of every good thing is part of its goodness, right? It's just sort of like almost like as anti-stoic as you could get, right? It's sort of like you if you were trying to insulate yourself from loss, you have entirely sort of lost the way. Anyway, so I'm sort of wondering like how Epicurus would respond to both of those folks. Would he give a sort of, how would he respond to sort of, how does his posture towards death help him respond to Stoics? How does his posture towards death help him respond, or perhaps join? I don't know. Would he be of common cause with Hagelin in certain ways?
Yeah, I own the Hagelin book, and I started it, and at some point, I was teaching, and but it was really, I thought this is really great. It's just really well framed, and so it was great listening to your conversation, because I did at least read enough of it to know where he was going, and I do think there's something, first of all, about I think Epicurus thinks that you can enjoy life, as long as it lasts without needing it to last more. So there's this line, I think it's from Metrodorus, although it comes down in Epicurean text, of the person who least needs tomorrow goes most happily to greet it. Right. So if you wake up the next day, it's great. You're like, good, I get another day. Right. That's awesome. Yeah. And so you just get a lot more joy out of not needing it. Yeah. And he has that idea about most extravagances, right? The person who doesn't need it enjoys it more. Like if it's rarer or just it can give you this sort of like sense of wonder, like, oh, I'm still awake. I'm still alive.
We've done some work on joy around here, thinking about joy, and like you you rejoice over your bonus. You don't rejoice over your salary, right? I mean, and maybe the first time you get it, right? Like you get a new job, like, okay, I rejoice over it, right? Yeah, but it's that sort of sense of extravagance that triggers a certain kind of response. And so if you could cultivate more sense of, where if more things sort of come to you as a gift that way, you might have more causes for joy.
Yeah, I mean, I actually wonder whether he would even think like you rejoice over your salary. Right?
Yeah.
Still got
you should learn to do that, right? Because if you don't take it for granted, then you would have more. If the fewer things you take for granted, I mean, that makes sense. Like the less entitlement, the more joy. That seems about right.
But it is true that that he thinks security is very important, and so he's not going to deny that. Say, if a professor gets tenure, that's not a great relief. It's sort of like, okay, yeah, my institution might fold, but I at least have a lot more security than before. And the question is, do you constantly appreciate that security, or do you grumble? Like, my institution is not properly appreciating me. But I do think that I'm really intrigued by Hagelund, but I don't want to misrepresent him because I haven't read him or thought about it more than you interviewed him. But there is something that's interesting about it, right? So this idea that we have a responsibility to maintain what gives meaning in life, and that results from vulnerability that we shouldn't deny or try to escape. And I do think that there's something about that, and I think there's something to that in Epicurus as well, right? So one of the things that I think is distinctive of Epicurus, if you're comparing him to the Stoics, is that I do think that Epicureans, because he sees us as animals and not self-sufficient animals, does think we're inherently vulnerable, right? And so the way that we navigate the world is to manage that vulnerability, right? And managing that vulnerability is not like purely strategic or self-centered, but it does include things like, when you're in a friendship, it's mutual vulnerability that gets you there, right? At least from the starting point. And that could be different kinds of vulnerability. And then the way that you keep things going is to continue in the activities, say, of Epicureanism or friendship, that sort of like give life meaning. And if you can do that with the understanding that you're doing that without, you're doing that because that's what gives life meaning, not an afterlife or not an endless life, then I do think it gives it a kind of extra. I think I'm on Hagelund's side. I think it gives it a kind of extra joy, but I can see how people would feel differently about that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll turn squarely back to Epicurus. Keep ourselves here, but you talk about at several points as an important reference point that he actually founds. I guess lots of ancient philosophers founded schools, but it feels a little bit more like he founded like a commune or something. I don't know. Like he founds like a community, a residential school. But I don't even know how much to think about it as like an educational institution, and how much to just think about it like just like a commune, right? Like, by which I mean, I don't know what their economic policies were, but I guess mostly what I'm thinking there is just like residential life among some like common-minded people, a sort of very intentional sort of way of life, trying to live out a shared set of values. He calls it, or it's called the garden. I gather. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about? Of course, it's very theologically resonant to think like life in the garden. Tell me about life in the garden for Epicurus.
Yeah, so I think it is a really fascinating feature of Epicureanism. The garden was an actual. I should say at the beginning that what we know is limited, and I'm not a classicist. I'm a philosopher. So some of this material culture stuff, I'm sure there's cutting edge work on the garden, but I'm not privy to that. But it was on the outskirts of Athens, right outside the defensive wall. So it really wasn't far outside of Athens. It wasn't even really like suburban.
Well, yeah, apparently Walden Pond was close enough for, Thoreau's mom to do his laundry or something. So,
and
it doesn't take far, apparently.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a resemblance there, actually, the kind of mystique people have about Walden. And then, so what's interesting is that the garden, they did live together. Epicurus had a house in the city, actually. So he kind of had a property and a house, but then he had this garden where people lived together, and it was in some sense communal. But it's worth pointing out that you mentioned the economic circumstances, and he was really adamant that you didn't divide resources equally or communally. He thought that that implied that you didn't trust people. And that part of what you're doing, right, is supporting one another such that, if someone falls into material distress, you trust your friend to help you out, or sort of like it's a voluntary exchange. And this is actually a dig at the Stoics, I think. So one thing we know is that Zeno of Citium and Epicurus founded their schools at the same time, like almost simultaneously. They were head-to-head rivals. It's like the Yankees and the Mets being founded at the same time, right? And Zeno of Citium, he had inherited these kind of Cynic features and Platonic things, and so he and some of the other early Stoics thought, even wives and children should be shared in common. Got rid of currency, and so in some sense, Epicurus is like, look, I don't know about that, because that just actually, I think that shows that you can't trust people with money or trust people to take care of each other.
So is it the idea that like private property is sort of the condition of the possibility of generosity? Like if you don't have your stuff and I don't have my stuff, then how could we ever be generous to one another?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a weird feature of Plato's Republic that he spends all this time talking about this fancy education that they give to the guardians, the people who protect the city. And this is the group of people from whom the philosopher ruler will come. And they get this huge education, and then Socrates says, and they're all going to live together and eat together. And, that sounds normal, but then he's like, and they can't even touch money. Like they can't even touch it. And he says something like, because they've got gold in their souls and it would taint it, right? But the understanding is something like, even when you've given people this perfect education, money is going to ruin it, right? So there's a kind of sense even of what human desire does in the company of money. And Epicurus seems to be rejecting that, or at least saying that, this is something we can deal with. So it's not even just like everything in common, we're all equal, or it's just sort of like, look, human beings can handle this. And in fact, our ability to trust one another to handle it is really important. Now, that may only happen when people share the same kind of attitudes towards money, but it's definitely a different way of thinking about economics in the community. That we took that pretty far afield into economics, but it is kind of important to think about how he thought friendship and community worked, and trust and mutual self-support.
Yeah. Well, friendship does seem to be a really important feature of life for him. And you offer some like really, I think you've got like 3 really practical sort of principles. Maybe people don't believe us because of our conversation, but I will insist. This is actually, at the end of the day, an extraordinarily practical book. Don't let the Oxford University Press logo fool you. there's practical life advice here.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's amazing about the book series, actually, is that the series editor, Stephen Grimm, and then the Oxford editor, Lucy Randall, are just sort of like, don't write this book unless it's going to be actually a practical book. And that actually set a kind of challenge for me. I hadn't really thought about doing it that way.
But as you point out, that's actually the spirit in which the Hellenistic philosophers, all these Greek philosophers, were doing their work. Is precisely with the expectation, like don't do this unless you expect to live it.
Yeah, and in fact, Epicurus was probably the most pointed about that. He just said, like, it's useless unless it helps people live a good life. Like, if you're doing it and it doesn't have that effect, then you should just stop.
Sorry, just like give that a moment to let that hit. But all right. So among the practical advice, well, I'll come back to a couple other things probably too. But you give sort of 3 points for like, how do you know if like a friendship is good? It's like if someone makes you feel insecure about your intellect, taste, status, or attractiveness, like No, it's not good. You say jump ship. If someone abandons us or others in crisis, they can't be trusted. And if we do not like who we become around someone, then the relationship does not benefit us. Those are some I could see where, like, especially like around like a seminar table with some undergraduates, like, here you go, like rules to live by. What more would you want to like sort of fill out for us in terms of like Epicurus' sort of picture of a flourishing, a thriving friendship?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because I put those towards the end of the book, which I take to be sort of entailments or like practical strategies for like sorting out what he thinks. And you're right, Epicurus thinks that he says the thing that contributes most to our well-being is friends. So he thinks it's at the center of his philosophy, which makes sense because they live together. And then he had this apparently just very close, lifelong relationship with some of the people who studied with him, both through letters. He wrote to some friends who were still in what's now Turkey, and then had friends who stayed in the garden with him for the rest of his life. And so he thought what you needed, the foundation of a friendship, any kind of relationship for him is trust. You have to have a bedrock trust. And once that's broken, it's hard to fix, and it has to be fixed or else the friendship can't continue. And that's, it's a kind of reliability, but not sort of like, my friend always shows up on time or anything like that. It's, will this person be there for me during the times of life that are bad? And if you were to think no, either because they haven't been there for other people or they failed for you, then that's when this is sort of when the rubber meets the road of a friendship. And there are a couple of reasons for that for Epicurus, but one of them is just that those times are hard, and we think of it that way, right? So even like Lionel Richie, something like that's what friends are for or something, and so there's that, but there's also this kind of shared conception of value, and that reinforces trust. So Aristotle actually gave this really great framework for thinking about friendship. He's in fact devoted 2 books of the Nicomachean Ethics to friendship, and he said, you enter friendships for a reason, and when that reason stops holding, then the friendship gets severed. So a good example of this in a modern time is like drinking buddies. So if you drink together and one person stops drinking, if that's the foundation of the friendship, then the friendship just kind of goes away unless it has a new reason. And so if you enter friendships for very unstable things, then the friendship is volatile, right? So like I enter a friendship because this person has a lot of status in my field, right? And then this happened actually as an example. And then that person just doesn't get tenure, right? And suddenly everyone's like, that they sort of just fall away. And so I've had a couple of friends say like, I figured out who my real friends were when I didn't get tenure. So, because people don't know how to respond, and then can't see you as advantageous anymore. So so there's a sense in which like what you want is something where it's within your control, and it's not comparative, and it's not competitive. And if you form a friendship because someone is very attractive, and then they meet some accident, and so the idea is that what you have to do is have this shared conception about what matters in a friendship, and it has to be very stable, right? And it has to be within the control of the person as much as possible, right? So things like kindness or generosity or reliability, and those are if you think that's why we're in the friendship and these other things don't matter, then your friendship is stable. The last one, though, you mentioned, this is actually something that it is kind of personal for me. So there is a sense in which, we continue these bad junior high habits into adult life. It's kind of shocking. And so we don't just like often make a friend. We fall into like a group or a friend community. And those dynamics kind of form themselves, right, about what matters in our group. And so it's not just that necessarily like one person makes you feel bad. It's usually more that like this is not a community I want to be in, right? Because either they gossip about one another behind their back, or you just see that their allegiances shift a lot, or you can see that they become attached to someone who suddenly gets status and not. And it's shocking that this is part of adult life. And so if you find yourself in a group where you're suddenly like, oh, well, I'm going to participate in this gossip, then it can feel bad. And if you recognize that it feels bad, you can do something about it. Even if it means, kind of severing those ties and looking for better ones, and maybe even having a bit of time where you're just like, okay, I got to find those people. But it is interesting how we can just get pulled into these dynamics that I'm just like, I don't like who I am right now. And people are aware of that feeling. It's like a sort of like big old horn honking in the background.
Yeah. I'm sorry. You got me at the sort of like all these middle school habits that don't go away. As parent of a middle schooler, this is worth further reflection, and it is like actually sort of omnipresent in my world. Yeah, but it's powerful that Epicurus is not just reflecting on these things and building arguments about friendships. He's doing all this work in the context of a community where they're living together, and you can sort of imagine the ways that, again, it's that fundamental sort of like posture about philosophy and what it's for. It's sort of like this is for living. We're gonna talk about these things. We're gonna work these things out, and we're gonna try them out, and we're gonna live them, and then we're gonna reflect upon those things, and we're gonna sharpen our insights as we sort of live our ideas and see which ones looked better in conversation than they did sort of in life. You also talk about one of his, and it seems like if I'm reading between, I don't have to read that much between the lines. It seems like you are conflicted about his invitation that we should live unnoticed, and. Well, I've got a line. I've got a line of questions here. So, but first, just tell us what does he mean by live unnoticed?
Well, so I mean, the short answer is no one really knows, and it's not even clear that he himself ever used that phrase. I mean, he probably did something like that because the Epicureans really did toe the line. You'll find that Stoics disagreed a lot about whether even like preferred indifference existed, and so they had disputes and all considered themselves Stoics, but the Epicureans really didn't like to depart too far. So probably he did. He definitely said sort of like, flee the trappings of like competitive education and he advised people like don't get caught up in politics, right? And so some people think it's just sort of like don't sell your soul for political power. It will get you killed, right? And that in itself, right, is sort of still true. Right? There's a lot of sacrificing of your values that goes into succeeding in politics, and that's why it's really hard to get good people into politics. Yeah. And so if he thinks that, then I think there might be crises where it's sort of like, well, look, I've got to do it, or somebody way worse than me will do it, and that will be bad for my security, and so I'm going to do it, right, because it produces greater good. And again, that's not super bad either. The real question is sort of like, did he think you shouldn't try to help other people through, communal engagement, right?
Yeah, sort of quietism.
Right. Yeah. And I think that there's a sense in which I think he didn't think that, but there's a lot of disagreement about this. That said, I do think that the Epicurean priorities, the taxonomy of desire itself kind of shapes however he would think about what matters in politics, right? So what matters in politics is going to be what's necessary for human well-being, right? And other things, so sort of unlimited things or things that are not, that draw attention away from things that are necessary, those are not good. So if those are your political aims, whatever might fall under that category, then it's pretty clear that Epicurus would think like, okay, let's go back to the necessary things that are constitutive of human security and well-being, and kind of serve the foundation for people to be able to seek joys. And so I think that insofar as he thinks there are political aims, they should be towards supplying necessary goods for people, so that that could stabilize either society or the community. It's making sure that people get fed. And actually in Athens at the time, there were food supply issues. So when he talks about being content with enough to survive on, he speaks from experience. And there's this really great book, and I'm blanking on the name of it now. I feel bad that I can't remember it, but it was just about how Athens managed to feed everyone. And it depended on people who were pillars of the community or people who had money stepping up and then getting praised for doing it, right? And so there's a sense in which, what Epicurus thinks goes right in Athens is that people get fed and clothed and they have fundamental security. And so I think to some extent that's always going to be Epicurus's goal. And when you say that's what matters, it can be very contentious. So I'm on the fence about how much political engagement can be attributed to Epicurus and stay within the confines of what the text says and what we know. But he does say that, Epicureans will take risks for goods, right? They're not just like, oh, I'm never going to take any risks, right? But it has to be a worthwhile aim. And so the question is how many political aims are worthwhile aims? And I figure that's got to be confined to necessary things for the most part, and then occasional extravagance. And it seems weird to say there's necessary social justice and extravagant social justice, but I'm not sure that he wouldn't think something like that.
Yeah. And it may just be that he's rendered a prudential judgment about the politics of his day, and we might make different prudential judgments about different political moments or different aspects even of politics, within our own context,
right?
And still remain within his view broadly.
Yeah, and it depends a little bit on what you take to be your community, right, and what you take to be security for your community. And so there are ways in which it could expand, but the root is that you need friends who form that foundation, and then probably you can take forays out from there, but you do you engage in the same kind of prudential calculation you do about other things, is this worth it? Am I being deceived into thinking that this really matters when it doesn't, or is this making me so upset that I need to step back because I'm clearly thinking of this in the wrong way? But yeah, he does think that we should think about politics differently than we probably do. And then another part of Live Unnoticed is probably a little bit too just about status, right? So not wanting to be the most admired, the center of attention.
Yeah.
Or, that's not a good thing for your psychology.
Yeah, well, so one last step before leave the politics, because then you have a separate chapter sort of on social media where suddenly Live Unnoticed seems like the most sage and modern advice one could, or sage advice for the modern moment. It may not be very modern, or typically modern. But on the politics, yeah, I mean the communal aspect does make me nervous, right? That seems like a potential big pitfall. In certain ways, some of the least sufficient. Some of my least just political reflection, comes from an overemphasis on, an excessive focus on my own little tight community, right? I think, especially again, as a modern Western, liberal in the, not in the political sense, in the broader sense, right? As someone who's embedded in a modern Western liberal society, I am trained to think that my political judgments will be more just the less parochial they are, the less they begin with my community and those closest to me, and that makes me, I think, immediately sort of suspicious of Epicurus on this point. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, so one thing that is interesting about Epicurus is that he welcomed women and slaves and the poor to live and study at the garden, right? So it wasn't just free-born Athenian male citizens hanging out in the garden. And in fact, that's what got him a little bit of a bad reputation. The women of easy virtue maybe are there, right? And
evidenced by the fact that they wrote books.
Exactly. Yeah. I think Cicero's line is something like, "Such was the wantonness of the garden that this woman wrote a book challenging Aristotle's student." So his idea of community, I think, really is people who are willing to think about their desires this way. Right? And it just turns out the world is often not. And we don't have, I think and again, this is an open question. I've heard people go both ways. And when I teach with my students, I think about it this way. So it's sort of like, how much should we get emotionally invested in things that are kind of beyond our control to secure? Can we just like actually be active in changing things within our orbit and tell ourselves, a lot of this is not, right? And so I think that, a lot of it was limited at the time, right? It's like, how is he going to change anything other than the environment he was in, other than by writing things and to some extent advertising his views, but not getting committed in whether people accept them, right? So I was raised in a very evangelical tradition. And I thought, at the time, I was like, oh, well, if people don't accept this, then like the horrible fates, right? And then I discovered there were these other traditions where like, no, that's not how it works. It doesn't matter. Yeah. So I do think there are reasons that you wouldn't want to limit, you wouldn't want to become a navel gazer. But there's also a little bit of a question about, the Stoics were known to be cosmopolitans, right? So they'd say, like, I'm a citizen of the cosmos. But there's a question really about what that means even, right? So there's this idea that there's a community of sages, or that, insofar as people adopt a way of thinking about life, they're kind of like part of your community. And so I think, again, Epicurus might just see some limitations for how much people are willing to think about things his way. And yeah, that could feel parochial, but I think he's just going to own it because he thinks this is a good way to live.
Yeah, again, and when the dominant, like, opposite, option, I know it's not, now we're getting later than his own time, but you could see how the Epicurean sort of tradition would continue to unfold when the dominant other option is in cahoots with, like, with Roman imperial authority, in many ways, like at its worst, in some of those moments.
So I mean,
really is accepted, but
yeah, if you think about Seneca, right? So he's this model Stoic. I mean, or at least he's an ideal Stoic, and for certain people, a flawed Stoic, obviously, and he recognized he was flawed, but he got pulled into this web of Roman intrigue, and so did Cicero, and it got them killed, right? And they sacrificed a lot of their values along the way, and maybe it's just Epicurus just thinks like, I don't think I don't want to make those moral compromises because I don't see the payoff as sufficient enough.
Yeah. So you might like ask yourself difficult political questions when your sphere of concern is making sure that the garden is this like healthy community of profound friendship. But you also might, and then sort of ask yourself, like, oh, shoot, is my sphere of concern too narrow? But you also might ask yourself some questions if you are, like, advisor to Nero. and you start to think, like, oh, shoot, maybe I have missed a turn somewhere along the way. But as I said, this slogan, wherever precisely the phrasing comes from, live unnoticed, seems to be, like, such good, important advice for thinking about social media. It seems like I thought it was like a brilliant sort of movie making the book to think, because you sort of like give this sort of concerned take on the politics, and you say, but what if we thought about social media? It seems that maybe that might help us isolate a particularly, a place where the prudential judgments seem to be rather straightforward.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting, right? Because I think Epicurus thinks almost everything is situational, right? So if it's something that helps maintain your sense of security or provides joy without producing harm, then it's fine, right? So if social media just suddenly transformed itself into this thing that really benefits us all, right? Epicurus would say, great, right? We can communicate with people far away, and all these things that we used to believe about social media, like I can keep in touch with my college friends, and so he's not opposed to it. And in fact, actually, there's this really vibrant Epicurean community online. It's very small because the Stoics have won the day, at least for now. But it is an internet community of people from all over the world who take Epicureanism seriously as a way to pursue a good life, given some, some of the shared commitments that Epicurus had about how the world works. And it seems to be a very, very happy online presence, right? But they operate on these Epicurean principles of just sort of like, don't, there are behavior rules, and there's, so there's, if you can use social media for good purposes and maintain it, then I think Epicurus would have no real problem with it. The thing is that it's just not that. That's not how it works for the most part, most of the platforms. And that's generally because it's designed to feed our corrosive desires, right? As many likes as possible, as many followers as possible. And that just puts us at the mercy of other people who don't share our values. And we're just trying to figure out, well, what pleases them, right? And this is clearly just a sort of, to me, it's a somewhat autobiographical vulnerability. I felt really bad on social media. I used to be on Facebook, and I got kind of lured into it in some way. And then, I was one of those people who was like, I'm going to stop. No, I'm not. I'm going to stop. And one day I was like, this is just really bad for me. And so I quit, and I haven't had a social media account since then. And there are some downsides to that, especially when it comes to book promotion or like, just sort of like, somebody please tell them about my book. Right. But also, I find out about things that, are happening in my friend's life later. But, my very close friends who live far away, I had a friend who just got a really nice job offer, and I called her yesterday and I hadn't talked to her in a while. And it's like, I didn't need to see the 30 pictures of her kid she's posted in the last couple of months, right? Because we had this really great conversation and reconnected. And so I don't feel like I've lost much, but I understand how other people might. And so it really is based on individual disposition and your own way of managing it. I think Epicurus he's not the sort of person who says like, social media is bad for everyone, right? I know especially older people who love looking at pictures of babies, and that's pretty much like all they do on it. So it's
what Facebook is becoming. Well, you've gotten us. Maybe we've come back to a question that I sort of came into this conversation with. Maybe we can end here, which is Epicurus wants us to be really thoughtful about our desires, sort of sort through them. And we're recording this in January. It's sort of New Year's resolution time, and it strikes me, and again, it's one of the things we talk about at Grace Farms, and some of the work that Katie and I do together. We sort of talk about the way that like a New Year's resolution is sort of doomed to fail if it sort of attempts to bypass your desires. Right? I will force myself to do this thing that I don't really want to, and it strikes us that any number of ancient traditions actually make a lot out of that sort of middle step that we seem to want to sort of skip over, sort of cultivation of desire, a sort of honing of desire, a sorting through of desires. But it puts a lot of weight on, I feel like, at least for myself, I sort of feel like, oh, that's a good line. I can use that. And I get a lot of like good nods from people like, oh yeah, I haven't really thought much about that. But then when they ask me like, so how do I actually change what I desire? I found myself a little bit like, well, I don't know. I'm a Christian theologian, so I assume it probably has something to do with spiritual disciplines of some sort. If I were holier, I'd be able to speak more from my own life. How would Epicurus advise us? How do we actually reform our desires, or like to change the balance? Is it about changing the balances? Is it about quieting the corrosive ones, or what? Or is it about cultivating the good ones? How?
I think it's probably a lot of things.
Okay.
So some of it is just actually taking the time to think about like, oh, I have this unlimited desire and I can't, that's a kind of desire that can't be satisfied. Can I put a limit on it? Right. Or, sometimes it's just, clearing up conceptual confusions. Right. Sometimes it's about, figuring out what you desire more and trying to focus on that. Right. So I desire this, but I desire this other thing more. And if you can't desire that other thing more, then you just have to say like, well, I guess I just really desire this more. But I do think one of the things that, and there's, I think, a lot of empirical evidence to bear this out, that the answer has got to be to some extent just contained within Epicureanism, which is that you surround yourself with the right people. And you want to be part of that community, and that community cares about certain things. And they might actually not care about things that we convince ourselves we should care about, right? So it could turn out that sometimes our New Year's resolutions are really like they're kinds of ways of thinking about perfection that we don't really need, so that we're, in fact, our desire to do this more and more and more might be a corrosive desire, right? So it kind of depends on even what kinds of resolutions we're setting. So if our resolution is like, I'm going to go volunteer and meet people, right? That's like a fixed thing. And you know why you would want to do it. And it might be a little hard, but it's fixed. It's not like I'm going to exercise every day this year, or I'm going to...
I will never...
I will never. This will make me better, right? I will be a better person. And so I think that Epicurus would probably be suspicious of that kind of thinking anyway. But mostly I think it's, there's lots of evidence that if you surround yourself with a certain group of people, then you just become more like them. And so if you're really status conscious, then find some people who aren't, who can kind of balance that out, right? And so a lot of it is actually communal. I think we have this, maybe it's an American self-reliance thing. Like, I'll pick myself up by my own bootstraps. And, actually there's somebody who is very much an Epicurean had a thing that sort of like, he wanted to quit smoking. So he calculated how much it would cost to continue smoking for a month. And then he bought this really beautiful copy of Lucretius. And I don't own any rare books. I've never been a rare book person. I just figured the words are the same. but it was a really beautiful book. And his idea was like, well, if I smoke, I can't do it until I sell the book, right? And he just really loved the book. And I thought, wow, that's ingenious. I don't know whether it worked, but so there are ways that we can think about what we care about more, and that might really help. I mean, this is a guy who is clearly Epicurean enough to spend the money on an Epicurean book, and so this is his take on what Epicurus would have a person do. But so I still think, though, it's mostly about friends who hold you accountable, but only about things that actually matter instead of about things that kind of we convince ourselves matter.
Emily, that is a great place to land it. Thank you so much for this book.
This has been
thanks
great.
For the conversation today.
You're a super fun conversationalist.
Well, we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.